So I'm talking about fairness tonight, and at the request of someone in the meditation group. And I recently read a little story in something else I was reading. And all I remember about this story is that a 3-year-old was on the floor, pounding his fist into the floor and screaming, or maybe it was a her, screaming, "It's not fair, it's not fair." And the reason I don't remember the rest of the story is because I don't even remember what was fair or not, is because I was so struck that a 3-year-old knows what fairness is. I mean, when you think about it, fairness is a relatively complex concept. And here's this little 3-year-old who knows exactly what it means and what it's all about and can use the word in a sentence and everything. And so it caused me to think that perhaps fairness is something that's pretty hardwired into us. And unfairness is it's pretty hardwired that unfairness isn't fair. It's not okay. So, we have this concept of fairness at an early age and we insist on it and we're mad about it. We get mad, when things aren't fair. Now, fast forward to my very earliest days as a monk. Maybe I was a postulant, and I was in the dining hall at the Abbey, and we were, I think it must have been a snack day. Monks were in there sort of eating their snacks and coming and going, and we were grousing about life and that sort of thing. And somebody said about something that we were talking about, it's not fair. Life's not fair. And there was a monk there whose name was Fudoshin, who happens to be in this room tonight, who said, I think I'm quoting him, but this happened 27 years ago, so I may not have this quite right. But what I think he said was something to the effect of, that's just the problem. Life is always fair. Karma sees to that. So I remember that all these years, that kind of stopped me short, that we get our karmic comeuppances, and they're very fair. And, I'm not really going to talk about karma in this talk, but maybe that's something we can talk about in our discussion if you want to. So I kind of wanted to start by talking about things that aren't fair, just to make a bit of a list to demonstrate how wide this category is. Things we might readily consider unfair. So the 3-year-old, it could be he or she got that toy to play with and I didn't. And, we're never too old for this one. It sounds like a 3-year-old, but in fact, I've heard these very words spoken at very high levels in our government in the past day or two. So, there you have it. Or how about, now these are not things that I'm putting these in I words, but they didn't actually happen to me. So don't get worried here. But how about, my brother's 25 years old and about to die of cancer? That's not fair. I have dementia. That's not fair. My house burned down. That's not fair. Blacks can't go to that school. Only whites can go to that school. Not fair. Other places in our lives where this shows up, winning fair and square, which means something like following the rules. No one likes a cheat. There's always the possibility that the rules aren't fair, and then we have to come to terms with that. Fair trade. Fair trade is a relatively modern concept. It's a term for an arrangement designed to help producers in developing countries achieve sustainable and equitable trade relationships with developed countries. That's a quote from a dictionary somewhere. So we have fair trade. We have the whole notion of an exchange economy. You give me this and I get that. Money is an exchange economy. And I think that we often see this as a pejorative. But It does favor fairness. It does allow for there to be fairness. Dana, on the other hand, is theoretically not an exchange economy, though it's very hard for us to think of Dana not as an exchange economy. So maybe Dana isn't fair. Or how about diversity, equity, and inclusion? To me, fairness seems to imply some kind of equity, in a sense, really, of tit for tat. But the Buddha said that if you think you're superior, you're wrong. And if you think you're inferior, you're wrong. And if you think you're equal, or we're all equal, you're also wrong. So he kind of tripped us up on the equity business. And the reason you're wrong is because superior, inferior, and equal all imply the existence of a self. And it led me to wonder whether or not equitable was a better word for fair. Is it fair that some people have billions of dollars and some people have nowhere to live? Is it fair to tax the rich more than the middle class or the poor? Or is it unfair to take away money from the rich that they rightfully earned? What is fair taxation? Should the rich be receiving Social Security? Is that fair? And what about paying taxes for things you don't believe in? What do I think I ought to get from society? And what do I need to give to society? What do we owe each other? Now, the word justice is a word that's not completely separate from fairness. If something's just, it ought to be fair. Is fairness the result of justice done? And if justice is not done, don't the victims of a crime feel cheated in some way? So I would ask, are fair and just interchangeable? And finally, is fairness doing what's right, whatever the heck that means? So that's kind of what comes to mind for me when questions of fairness arise. Now, let's consider the story of Angulimala. And some of you may be very familiar with this story. It's a story from the Pali Canon. Angulimala was a mass murderer. This is because he was this spiritually adept human being who was studying with a fine teacher who, because of various political things that were going on, asked Angulimala to bring him the fingers of 1,000 people. So Angulimala went out and started murdering people and taking their fingers and wearing them as a necklace around his neck. And he had murdered 999 people. And then one day he caught sight of the Buddha and decided the Buddha would be his 1,000th person. And the Buddha just kept on walking. And Angulimala started chasing the Buddha. And the Buddha just kept on quietly walking. And Angulimala ran faster and faster and faster, and he couldn't catch up with the Buddha. And finally, Angulimala yelled, "Stop!" And the Buddha stopped and turned to Angulimala and said, "I have stopped. When will you stop?" And Angulimala was so struck by this that he immediately repented, more or less on the spot, and asked to be ordained as a monk. The Buddha ordained him, and he was admitted into the Sangha, the monastic Sangha. So having repented his deeds. So here's a horrific criminal, right, who served no jail time, was not given the death sentence, and he lived the rest of his life as a monk and apparently did very well in his training. So what's fair about all of that? However, when Angulimala went to town, beg for food, as monks did back in those days. Rocks and rotten vegetables were thrown at him, and he returned to the monastery bleeding with his robes torn and his alms bowl broken, apparently. And when he asked the Buddha about this, the Buddha said, well, this is the karmic consequence of your past actions. So we're back to karma and his karma fair. And Angulimala could accept that. He realized that this was the price he was paying. And we might say it's a small price to pay for what he had actually done. So I want to leave that story at this point, and I'll come back to it later. To continue on with some other things about fairness that I'd like to say. According to the dictionary, fair means in accordance with rules or standards, legitimate, just, or appropriate in the circumstances, without cheating or trying to achieve unjust advantage. Now, to me, that's all nice and neat, but the idea of fairness is actually a pretty squirrely word, and it's a very emotional word. We get emotional around fairness very rapidly. And I wonder if this is what we really mean when we're screaming, it's not fair. That said, I want to say that fairness or fair is not a Buddhist word. It was not used by the Buddha, and I find this very interesting. Thanissaro Bhikkhu, who is a living, fine monk and great Pali scholar, says it's not in the Pali Canon. And I decided to check on that a little bit. Now, he probably went online and searched for it and it did not come up, but I have, 3 fat volumes from the Pali Canon, which is a small part of the Pali Canon. And I looked in the subject index in all 3 of them. Fair is not there. Justice is not there. Equity is not there. It's interesting. So fairness is not a Buddhist word. Take that as a background. Now, what we usually do about lack of fairness, Joko Beck actually describes very well in Everyday Zen, which we had been reading. She says, it doesn't make any difference what's happening. It may be very unfair. It may be very cruel. All of us have things happen to us that are unfair, mean, and cruel. And our usual way is to think, this is terrible. We fight back, we oppose the event. We try to do as Shakespeare said, to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. It would be nice if it did end the slings and arrows of most outrageous fortune. Day by day, we all meet events that seem to be most unfair, and we feel that the only way to handle an attack is to fight back. And the way we fight is with our minds. Now, I might dispute that. Sometimes we don't just fight with our minds. Sometimes we take action. But in any case, she goes on to say, we arm ourselves with our anger and our opinions, our self-righteousness. This is what I mean when I say this is an emotional. Fairness is an emotional kind of word. So we arm ourselves with our anger and our opinions, our self-righteousness, as though we were putting on a bulletproof vest. And we think this is the way to live our life. All that we accomplish is to increase the separation, to escalate the anger, and to make ourselves and everyone else miserable. So no wonder fair is not a Buddhist word. All we accomplish is to increase the separation, escalate the anger, make ourselves and everyone else miserable. So this kind of response to fairness that Joko Beck's talking about only creates little or big wars. And by war here, I mean, bumping up against each other. And that might be some small event between two people, or it might be two nations at war with each other, or for that matter, the world fighting. It's fighting, combat, us against them, one thing opposed to another. So you can see where I'm probably headed here. But the reason that fair is not a Buddhist word is because it's inherently dualistic. It's oppositional, it's fighting. And to see, speak, think, and act dualistically creates suffering, as we know. As Beck suggests, it's selfing. It creates other, and it increases separation. So when our sense of unfairness arises, what's really going on there is that self is arising. Okay, and this is the fundamental problem, because when self arises, suffering arises. And if our project is to end suffering, if that's what our Buddhist practice is about, then fair isn't going to work. It's not going to serve that end. Suffering ends when we can stop creating a barrier between our imagined self and the unity of life that is Buddha nature, between our imagined self and the total interconnectedness of all that is. When we really get it, that we are a part of Indra's net. And to turn Christian on you, whatever we do to one of these, we do to ourselves. An eye for an eye may be fair, but compassion and wisdom work better if we're interested in creating a livable world, and a world that is better than materialism, if I can put it that way. Compassion and wisdom work better than fairness, to create a livable world. We can insist on fairness because, as Reverend Master Daishin Morgan writes in one of his journal articles, we believe that at the center of our being there is a hole to be filled before we can be healed or at peace. And so we are driven to obtain whatever it is that we think will fill the hole. The trouble is that no matter how much we get, it will never be enough. Whether it's compensation, love, recognition, fame, or gain that we seek makes no difference to the mechanism that is at work. However many rights we are granted by others, it will not fill this void. So we think that external circumstances are the answer to unfairness, but no matter how long we fight, we'll never fill that hole. Things will never be fair. We can spend our whole lives trying to engineer the world to be fair, and it will never happen. And as I have been suggesting, when we see things as unfair, we can become jealous, bitter, angry, hateful. Hatred resolves nothing. This is Reverend Daishin again. Hatred resolves nothing. I love this way. It only moves the dirt from one place to another and makes the pile higher in the process. So whenever experiencing any of these emotions, we can't see clearly. So to deal in fairness is to deal in suffering. Again, an eye for an eye may be fair, but compassion and wisdom work better if we're interested in creating a livable world, a world better than the world we find ourselves in, if we're interested in ending suffering. So some antidotes to our proclivity to want to have everything be fair. First, Let go of the affronted self. Stop seeking redress. Let go of the self, period. You know, our spiritual lives ask us to let go of the self completely. Completely. So let go of the affronted self. Allow bitterness to heal. Don't nourish bitterness. And of course, practice acceptance, which doesn't mean that society's inequities can't be addressed. But before we can address them in a way that's going to help, coming to acceptance is crucial. Also, practice self-respect and respect for all beings, no matter how depraved you may think they are still worthy of respect. And I'm talking about all beings here, not just human beings. And then, obviously, live with wisdom and compassion. Bring kindness into everything that you do. And do what is good to do based in an open heart. And knowing what's good to do isn't necessarily easy. But when we do what's good to do based in an open heart, we're living in the onward flow, the internal flow of life, rather than setting up oppositions and obstacles that just create suffering. So now let me go back to the story of Angulimala, which to me suggests something crucial to consider in this matter of fairness, and that is mercy. Because what I think the Buddha showed Angulimala was mercy, which the dictionary defines as compassion or forgiveness shown to someone whom it is within one's power to punish or harm. Showing compassion, showing kindness, offering forgiveness when we could harm someone or punish them. To me, mercy is an amazing virtue, because to me it defies what every cell of our being is telling us must be done. No, you can't show that person mercy. Not Angulimala, 999 murders, no way. You know, it's just so counterintuitive. But when we're merciful, we stand fairness on its head and do something completely unwarranted in the situation. The other becomes us, and we point towards the Buddha nature of all beings. We point towards the Buddha nature of all beings. So how can we not make this choice? It requires that we put selfing down completely. And in that moment, we are the world. This is our true freedom. This is how we live what we truly as Buddhists value. This is what clears the way for us to know Buddha, to know the unborn, to know what reality really is. Thank you.